Welcome, everyone, to the fourth of our fugitive word seminars. It's delightful to see you here. Today, we've got Uday Chandra, who is the fourth of the core team. He's a co-investigator of the project. He, as all of you know, teaches at the School of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. He received his PhD at Yale, then went on to Max Planck, where he was a research fellow, before landing at Georgetown. Now, Uday is an incredibly prolific writer who has written a great deal about, broadly speaking, state-society relations, about tribal matters, about democracy, bureaucracy, about comparatively as well as very locally in Eastern India. He has written a book that's coming out with Stanford University Press. It's called Negotiating Leviathan, subtitled Making Tribes and States in Modern India. So be on the lookout. He's also working on a second book project on Hindu nationalism and democracy. And today's talk will be very much related, I suppose, to the subject matter of the book he's working on now. So Uday, without further delay.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, and I'm going to now try to figure out the logistics of this. Okay, so can you all see the title of the
yes.
Yeah? Okay, perfect. So hopefully this is going to work, including the audio. All right, let's go. So Narendra Modi, who's the topic of my talk today, evoked strong emotions in his followers and critics alike. For his followers, he's of course a demigod whose every move must be defended, even revered, as astute. For critics, he's a dangerous politician whose every move must be attacked as ill-conceived and potentially lethal. For both critics and followers, however, Modi is a man of ceaseless action, not mere words. Yes, he's known to coin new words, acronyms, and slogans, but we are told that they matter far less than what he does. As such, neither followers nor critics seem to pay sufficient attention to Modi's speeches. And from the perspective of our project, this is a somewhat odd situation. No politician has promoted demotic speech in Indian vernaculars as much as Modi, from his days of defending Gujarati Asmita to his recent Didi O Didi taunts. I'm not going to talk very much about this, his Naga hornbill hat, except to just put it out there. And apart from a few anthropologists such as Peggy Froehrer and Arkatong Longkumar, there's been a marked reluctance on our part as scholars to study how the vernacular idioms of Hindutva bind together regions in a putative nation, usually in counterintuitive ways. In this paper, I make the case for taking Modi's words seriously. We think we may know what the man stands for. For those on the left who persist in the outmoded vocabulary of secularism and communalism, it will come as a surprise, of sorts, that Modi has failed to tell us what kind of Hinduism he practices, if any, and what he would like us to follow. He rarely invokes deities, let alone worships them publicly, and he makes anti-caste pronouncements of the kind that those on the left have been generally reluctant to make. We do not actually know very much, if anything, about Modi's religious or political beliefs, beyond the fact that he's been a lifelong time saver of the RSS. But he's neither a Nagpur Brahmin nor a subaltern foot soldier of the movement. Yet I argue that Modi's words are changing the terrain of democratic politics as well as Hindu nationalism in India today. He is, in other words, a political theorist that we ought to take more seriously. Is there a disturbance here in the background? Is there someone that perhaps we might mute? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. There was a kind of background noise, so I just wanted to get that out. I want to begin with a few disclaimers and caveats. Firstly, I do not want to say that only Modi's words matter, not his policies or aesthetic style, as you see in this slide. Those are certainly worth studying in themselves and in relation to his words. Second, in taking Modi's words seriously, it's not my contention that they're desirable in any normative sense. What I, as a person of mixed religious ancestry, feel personally about Modi's speech acts is quite different and somewhat inconsequential to my analytical aims here. Third, when I say that Modi is a political theorist, it doesn't obviously mean that he's a writer of treatises or peer-reviewed articles, but it does mean that his speech acts taken together constitute an important archive. And there is an actual archive that he's compiled, which I think I would recommend everyone should look at, which is called narendraModi.in, for understanding a distinct political theory with serious real-world implications compared to most of his academic counterparts. He's high on what they call impact in the UK. With these caveats in mind, I want to delve into two poems penned. That's how I would start with these two poems that Modi's penned. The first of these is titled Abhi to Suraj Uga Hai. The sun has just risen. And perhaps it is best to listen to it in Modi's own words.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
आसमां में सर उठाकर घने बादलों को चीरकर रोशनी का संकल्प ले अभी तो सूरज उगा है दृढ़ निश्चय के साथ चलकर हर मुश्किल को पार कर घोर अंधेरे को मिटाने अभी तो सूरज उगा है विश्वास की लौ जलाकर विकास का दीपक लेकर सपनों को साकार कर दे अभी तो सूरज उगा है न अपना न पराया न मेरा न तेरा सबका तेज बनकर अभी तो सूरज उगा है आग को समेटते प्रकाश को बिखेरता चलता और चलाता अभी तो सूरज उगा है
Subscribe to our YouTube.
Right. So it's not exactly a testament to his modesty. Modi presents himself as nothing less than the rising sun, piercing through gray clouds, determined to dispel the darkness around us, full of radiant hope and development, vikas, to fulfill your dreams. He assures us that much like the sun, he too does not belong to us or them, you or me, anapna na paraya, because his brilliance, his stage, illuminates everyone's lives. Managing its fiery nature and spreading the light, he wants to save us and free our tomorrow from the ruin and destruction in which we live today. The sun has just risen now, he assures us at the end, implying that sunny days lie ahead. Now, the second poem, I don't know if you can all read the Hindi, but I'll just kind of, this is called Hey Sagar, or Sea. It's another ode to nature, but here the people are personified as the sea or the Sagar. Modi wrote the poem in the ancient port city of Mahabalipuram. Saluting the sea, he praises it for its patience and depth, its vastness and life-giving properties. But he also notices its turbulent, even chaotic nature on the surface, which he interprets as arising out of a deep anger pain and grief. This he contrasts, he adds, contrasts with its calm beneath, its self-contained strength and boundless energy. Later in the poem, Modi turns to himself. The sun, he says, is an old relationship with the sea, bringing heat and light to its life-filled water that seemingly touches the sky and kisses the sun on the horizon. In turn, rain falls from the clouds and spreads joy and life on the earth. Now, without commenting on the literary quality of these poems, I want to point to the relationship that they propose between Modi and the people, or what Modi would like us to take away as the relationship between the sun and the sea. The sun belongs to the firmament, even as it appears to meet the sea in the distant horizon. In another political theological context, Leviathan may emerge from the expression of the general will. It may represent the sovereignty of contracting individuals. But the sun and the sea belong to separate realms. Their mutually reinforcing relationship, suggests Modi, brings life to earth. But the sun shines as it does due to its own radiance. It does not depend on the sea for sustenance. By contrast, the sea without the sun will be dark and turbulent, he suggests. For someone labeled a populist or a populist authoritarian, as you sometimes see in scholarship, Modi seems remarkably aloof from the people. It is as if the people need him, but he does not necessarily need the people. As he put it famously, this owes to his self-image as a fakir, who can quit any time to wander only with his jhola or satchel accompanying him. For those in doubt, read his Gujarati poem, Ramta Ram Akela, I am the lone wanderer. As a worldly ascetic, it would appear that Modi belongs to a tradition that in modern times counts Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekananda, and to a lesser extent, Gandhi in its ranks. Ascetic masculinity, we've been told, is the source of their authority, and as Joseph Alter and Chandrima Chakrabarti have shown, a diet and sexuality are two key pillars of this way of being. And this is why we must take him rather seriously. When Modi says the BJP is not just an election-winning machine, he claims that elections are sacred, very much like some anthropologists. And those who equate democracy, Loktantra, with winning elections do not understand the depth or gehrai, maturity of democracy in India. Again, that word we saw in the poem, depth, gehrai. What Modi would like us to believe is that the BJP under his leadership wins major elections because it reflects or mirrors the deep desires of the Indian people, who could, in principle, choose differently if they were if they wanted to do so. In his 2019 re-election kind of victory speech, Modi points to the record voter turnout, the highest ever in a national election, despite temperatures of 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. And he says, I'll just put it up there. This is the Gujarati poem, which I can share with you later. He says this is from the re-election rally, the victory rally. He says, this is in itself, the victory in itself is the Indian citizens' awareness, its commitment to democracy, and the entire world has to register to recognize India's democratic prowess. And this collective desire, far greater in substance than what Rousseau had in mind when articulating the notion of the general will, is fundamentally indivisible for Modi. And so he said after his re-election, same speech, this is what he has to say. When the battle of the Mahabharata ended, Lord Krishna was asked, whose side were you on? At that time in the Mahabharata, the answer that Lord Krishna had given today in the 21st century, in the 2019 elections, the people of India, the 130 crore citizens, have given the same answer as Lord Krishna. Lord Krishna had said that he was not fighting for any side. I was only on the side of Hastinapur, he had said. The citizens of the country have stood on the side of India, voted for India. I've been saying from the first day of this election, no party is fighting this election, no candidate is fighting, no leader is fighting this. This election is being fought by the people of this country. Those who had their eyes and ears closed found it difficult to understand my words. But today the people have expressed my feelings. Therefore, if there is a winner today, it is India. And if there's a winner today, it is democracy. And if there's a winner today, it is the people. So if the general will is divided into the sum of individual wills, or in Laclau's terms, the idea of the people dissolves into the factions and demands of the empirical, actually existing people, only a highly procedural conception of democracy remains. This is the post-war US model of representative democracy or polyarchy, in which pluralism and agonism are key attributes. This is not what Indian democracy looks like to Modi. Democracy in India has, for Modi, not ceased to be a competitive affair. Not everyone has voted for him or his party, but the message is there is no alternative either, TINA, T-I-N-A. It is simply that a new relationship between the people and a leader has emerged, akin to that between the sun and the sea, he would like to suggest. This is a view set forth clearly in his victory speech after the 2014 elections. An absolute majority, he said there, emerged as an expression of the general will after the electorate, or the matdata, the voters, exercised their mandate responsibly, zimmedari ke saath. There is an implication that without a responsible electorate, Modi would not be able to win power democratically. This new relationship between the ruler and the ruled is democratic, yet hierarchical. It is, however, the kind of hierarchy that is peculiar to the workings of democracy in India and elsewhere. Those who rule may claim to be like us, they may even claim to be chaiwalas, but when in office, they exercise power over us. Of course, in formal as well as in substantive terms, democracy also implies equality in terms of one person, one vote. Loktantra in India, therefore, reflects both hierarchical and egalitarian values, with the leader, with the capital L, standing above and steering the people. This new relationship between hierarchy and equality brings me to the topic of Hindutva. David Gellner has suggested that it might be better understood as Hindu modernism. V.D. Savarkar would have agreed, and I strongly suspect Modi would too. Gellner, following David Lorenzen in Who Invented Hinduism, decries the left liberal idea that Hinduism is a colonial era invention. Arcane scholarly debates over the great and little traditions of whether Hinduism should be understood as one or many have transposed now onto the terrain of democratic politics. For Modi, as for Savarkar, Hinduism is a vast melange of texts and rituals, some Sanskritic, some Puranic, and many Laukik, or folk traditions. But their definition differs from the Gandhian neologism, Sanatan Dharma, the eternal or perennial faith or path. Hindutva is a new political religion, by contrast, of all those who claim India, in Savarkar's word, as their Punya Bhumi and Pitri Bhumi, the fatherland and the place where they go about their business, I suppose. And definition of political Hindus as the people, necessarily by this definition, it excludes Muslims and Christians by default, because as we know, Savarkar said they owe their allegiance to Mecca, to the Ottoman Caliphate, to Rome, to the Church of England, and so on. Of course, there's always the possibility, he said, you see this now with Shuddhi or Ghar Vapsi, for anyone wishing to reconvert back into Hinduism. Another implication of Savarkar's new political religion that is worth pointing out before we get to Modi is anti-caste thinking. Savarkar himself wrote vociferously against caste and organized intermarriages and interdining sessions that irked the Brahmins of Nagpur. Now here's Modi in his 2019 victory speech saying, those who want a brighter future for the country have built a new narrative with this election for the unity of the nation. The weaker sections of society have forced the country to reconsider their old beliefs. Now there are only two castes living in the country, and the country is going to be focused on these two castes. In the 21st century, there is a caste, the poor, and other castes in the country who have some contribution to free them of poverty. Now, this is, it's a kind of striking redefinition of the caste question in our times, and it really goes well beyond Savarkar in policy terms to bring the spirit of Mandal into union with Hindutva today. And I am going to play this clip, which might...
संस्कार यही वजह है कि दुनिया के सबसे बड़े लोकतंत्र के सबसे ऊंचे शिखर पर बैठे प्रधानमंत्री मोदी को कुंभ में सफाई कर्मियों के पैर धोने में भी हिचक नहीं होती। परिवार से मिली यही सीख प्रधानमंत्री मोदी को वंशवाद पर तीखा हमला करने की ताकत देती है।
वंशवाद की बेल पकड़कर ये लोग इतना ऊपर चढ़ चुके हैं कि गरीब को तुच्छ मानते हैं, गंदगी साफ करने वालों को तुच्छ मानते हैं। वही गरीबी से पैदा हुआ, गरीबी में पला, गरीबी में बड़ा, गरीबों के आशीर्वाद से। उसने कुंभ के मेले में गरीबों का पैर धोकर सफाई कर्मचारी का पैर धोकर खुद धन्य हो गया।
So you get the point. This is very, so it does. So I want to kind of make the continuity, but also point out to some contrasts between the Savarkar Modi kind of continuum. This exercise in redefining Hindutva today reconceptualizes the middle classes as a caste that is free of poverty and owes a responsibility to bring the poor into its ranks. To do so, the country, which is what you would call Savarnas, that's how to be more precise, he says the country must reconsider their old beliefs. Hindutva as a project of national integration is thus conscious that the conceptual people or political Hindus are not identical to the empirical, actually existing people or Hindus. Hindutva under Modi must ensure that all people can become political Hindus as per Savarkar's vision, but in some distant future. To do so, Modi tells us, or tells his followers subtly, that Mandal cannot be ignored. He says there are the ones who want to come out of poverty and the ones who want to bring people out of poverty. We have to empower these two. If you think this is simply a kind of economistic rendition of Savarkar's original ideas, think again. After the Bhumi Pujan, the groundbreaking ceremony at the Ayodhya temple last August, Modi gave a 35-minute speech in which he characterized the Ram temple as the culmination of many popular struggles against slavery, gulami of the last 1,000-odd years. This is what he said. Several generations have made selfless sacrifices for several centuries for the construction of the Ram temple. Today marks the culmination of that centuries-old penance, sacrifices, and resolve. There was sacrifice, dedication, resolve during the movement for the construction of the Ram temple, and that dream is being realized today because of their sacrifices and struggles. I, on behalf of the 130 crore people of the country, salute them and bow before them for their sacrifices, which have led to the foundation of the Ram temple. And he ends by saying Ram belongs to all and is in everyone. Modi articulates something here that scholars studying Indian politics and history do not often talk about. This is the vernacularization of Savarkar's quirky idea of a political Hinduism vis-a-vis popular religious idioms long established by Ram-centered bhakti in northern and western India. The rejection of Brahmanism, the ulama, and the adoption of Saguna Bhakti in this particular instance, with devotion to popular Vaishnav deities such as Ram or Krishna, has long had an amalgamating effect on disparate castes and creeds in these parts of the Indian subcontinent. Modi, unlike Savarkar, is willing to draw on this prior tradition and harness it to make a new case for Hindutva in a modern democratic context. The origins of the people may lie deep in the medieval past, but for Modi, Hindutva is the modern expression of its political unity. He adds about the Ram temple that it's a modern symbol of our culture, and explains why he uses the word modern, because he believes that this is something which will become an object that represents the collective willpower, as he calls it, of millions of people. And he goes on to use a metaphor from the Ramayana. He says, starting with his characteristic mitron, friends, he says, with the enshrining of this temple, there's history that is being made and it's in the making, but it also is repeating itself, which is also, of course, a way in which the word history, of course, is being defined in a particular idiom. And he gives an example, several examples from the Ramayana and from the life of Krishna, and then you see Shivaji, and you see a number of other national icons, or at least Hindu nationalist icons, along with Gandhiji, who are brought in together. And at the end, what you see here is that the sacred task of the construction of the Ram temple began in the same way with the support of the people. Okay. This conception of the people, as going back earlier, as the sagar awaiting the sun, is, I suggest, is something we should see as a particular theological, more specifically messianic turn, as much as a political one. Here we have notions of avatar or incarnation, particularly those identified in the Kali Yuga as Kalki, and these are worth exploring much further. And hope you can think with me with this. The people for Modi were forged under 1200 years, as he says, of slavery. And until his arrival on the political scene, they were denied their rightful place by the politics of corruption. All prior elections, said Modi, were marred by the politics of corruption. I'm going to play the clip and then I'll say what I have to say.
विकास करना है तो हो सकता है, लेकिन सिर्फ अपनों का ही विकास करना हो तो फिर राज्य का कभी भला नहीं होता है। आपने वो सरकारें अब तक देखी है, अपने लिए अपनों के लिए करने वाली सरकारें बहुत आई, आपके लिए करने वाली सरकार भारतीय जनता पार्टी ही हो सकती है। और इसलिए मैं आपसे आग्रह करने आया, भाइयों बहनों, आप सच्चे दिल से मुझे एक जवाब देंगे? आप सच्चे दिल से मुझे एक जवाब देंगे? पक्का देंगे? दोनों हाथ ऊपर करके देंगे? पूरी ताकत वाले जोर से देंगे? आप मुझे बताइए, इस देश को भ्रष्टाचार ने बर्बाद किया है कि नहीं किया है? भ्रष्टाचार ने देश को लूटा है कि नहीं लूटा है? भ्रष्टाचार ने गरीब का सबसे ज्यादा नुकसान किया है कि नहीं किया है? भ्रष्टाचार ने गरीब का हक छीना है कि नहीं छीना है? हमारी सभी मुसीबतों की जड़ में भ्रष्टाचार है कि नहीं है? अब मुझे बताइए, भ्रष्टाचार रहना चाहिए कि जाना चाहिए? भ्रष्टाचार रहना चाहिए कि जाना चाहिए? भ्रष्टाचार को खत्म करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए? मुझे बताइए, ये अपने आप जाएगा क्या? ये अपने आप जाएगा क्या? ये भ्रष्टाचार ये कहेगा अब मोदी जी आप आए हो, मुझे डर लगता है, मैं जाता हूं, जाएगा क्या? नहीं जाएगा क्या? उसको डंडा लेके निकालना पड़ेगा कि नहीं निकालना पड़ेगा? कानून का उपयोग करना पड़ेगा कि नहीं करना पड़ेगा? बेईमान लोगों को ठीक करना पड़ेगा कि नहीं करना पड़ेगा? भ्रष्टाचारियों को ठिकाने लगाना पड़ेगा नहीं लगाना पड़ेगा? ये काम करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए? करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए? अगर कोई करता है तो गुनहगार है क्या? नहीं, कोई भ्रष्टाचार के खिलाफ लड़ाई लड़ता है तो गुनहगार है क्या? कोई भ्रष्टाचार के खिलाफ लड़ता है तो गुनहगार है क्या? भाइयों बहनों, मैं हैरान हूं, आजकल मेरे ही देश में कुछ लोग मुझे गुनहगार कह रहे हैं। मैं हैरान हूं भाइयों, क्या कारण है? क्या मेरा यही गुनाह है कि भ्रष्टाचारियों के दिन पूरे होते जा रहे हैं? क्या यही गुनाह है मेरा कि गरीबों को हक दिलाने के लिए काम कर रहा हूं? क्या यही है मेरा गुनाह कि गरीबों का हक छीनने वालों को अब हिसाब देना पड़ रहा है? भाइयों बहनों, जब कभी खबरें सुनते थे कि किसी के घर में रेड लगी तो बिस्तर के नीचे से करोड़ों करोड़ों रुपये मिल गए। ये पैसे किसके थे भाई? ये पैसे किसके हैं? ये पैसे किसके हैं? हिंदुस्तान की पाई पाई पर अगर किसी का अधिकार है तो 125 करोड़ देशवासियों का है दोस्त। विकास कर।
Okay. So, of course, the word corruption is used in its English form as well as Bhrashtachar in North India. We know that its theological roots lie in early modern Protestant criticisms of the church, long before the economists started using the more narrow definition of public office for private gain. Recall that anti-corruption talk emerged about a decade ago after high-profile scams under UPA 2, the previous government before Modi. A peculiar understanding of corruption arose at this time. One could accuse public officials, whether bureaucrats or politicians, of corruption to further the interests of their kin through nepotism and their clients through patronage. Corruption came to be defined by the anti-corruption movement that predated Modi's arrival as a kind of selfishness that thwarted the social mobility of others. Dynastic politics represented the apogee of this kind of political selfishness. Yet those who made allegations of corruption also wanted a piece of the pie. What they wanted was a kind of equality of opportunity in the matter. But there were two impediments to realizing this very democratic demand. The first impediment that they identified was caste-based reservations, which to Savarnas prevented them in the post-Mandal era of maintaining dominance in the public sector, and to others as an unfulfilled promise of upward mobility that had been thwarted by certain powerful OBC or SC groups such as the Yadavs or Chamars in North India. For both sets of malcontents, the Congress party, as much as caste-based parties committed to the language of social justice, the Samajwadi party, the BSP, the RJD of Lalu Yadav, were all deemed to be guilty of corruption. Others, as it were, had the right to be corrupt too. The people as a whole, to be precise, had this right. It is here that ascetic masculinity, whether for Anna Hazare or Narendra Modi, offered a symbolic way out of the problem, even if anti-reservation talk could now be confined to living rooms and online discussion forums. Whenever in doubt, for example, before the 2019 elections or now, a flowing beard or a meditative pose in a Himalayan cave sufficed. Wink, wink, the people got it. Now let's go to the second and more controversial impediment for anti-corruption campaigners, that is secularism. Modi, like most scholars, dates the problem back to the Shah Bano case of the late 80s. And this is what he said after his re-election. I just want to put it out there for you, where he says that he has eradicated all talk or the fake tag of secularism, as he puts it. And they have been, those who use this for political gain have, he says, been unmasked. Secularism, of course, doesn't have any precise Indic translation, nor does it stand for any definite policy prescriptions. This is a Sarkari neologism. We usually use dharm nirpeksh, or unbiased towards all faiths and creeds, and it seems to hark back to this idea of sarva dharma samabhava, that is, all faiths and creeds are equal. This was embraced by the likes of Gandhi, of Ramakrishna Paramhansa before this, but secularism until Rajiv Gandhi's intervention in the Shah Banu case seemed perfectly compatible with Sanatan Dharma, the perennial way. What makes secularism corrupt, then, to Hindu modernists today? It is far from the case, as the Sachar committee has showed, that Muslims have cornered lots of jobs in the public sector or dominate electoral politics anywhere, especially in North India. What links secularism to corruption talk, therefore, is the notion that has also been proposed by Advani and now Modi, that the state is pseudo-secular, that is, it is not dharm nirpeksh. It acts in a partisan way to block reform in a particular religious group in a quid pro quo for their votes. Corruption here is not about jobs and seats, as it is in the case of caste, but about a special dispensation that does not care for the socio-economic advancement of minority citizens, even as it freezes them in the framework of colonial law. Anti-corruption activists in and outside Hindutva are humanitarians in this regard. They care about and talk about the rights of Muslim women, LGBTQ persons, and so on. When Modi says the mask of secularism is no longer adorned by the Congress and its allies, it is because labels such as Muslim or Christian obscure a vast array of political orientations, some of which may well be amenable to inclusion within the people. Indian Muslims are implicated in statements about 1200 years of Gulami, as well as those about pseudo-secular politics. On the one hand, we have here the old Savarkarite idea of Muslims as existential enemies, and Muslim rule as an era of Hindu degradation. On the other hand, the BJP in democratic politics today has consistently stood against pseudo-secular politics of what it calls minority appeasement. The Uniform Civil Code that the BJP has demanded for decades will undo Macaulay's Penal Code of 1860 in the same manner that Article 377 was reversed as a meaningless Victorian imposition on a colonized people. A uniform civil code is also the logical next step after the abrogation of Article 370 on the status of the erstwhile princely state of J&K. Modi presented this constitutional amendment as an anti-terrorism measure, as well as a deliverance of long-denied rights, vanchit haq, to those living in Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. This, he added, abandoned the status quo of corruption, Bhrashtachar again, to bring peace and prosperity to Kashmiris and to bring them into the vast sea that is the Indian polity. Modi argued that the end of Kashmir's special status also countered Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, which he claimed had killed over 42,000 people over the past 3 decades. Lastly, Modi claimed that it was unheard of in any part of the world that a parliament exists as the repository of the sovereignty of the people, but it cannot make laws in a certain region of the country. This anomaly he needed, in his words, to be removed by a democratic exercise of sovereignty. And this is what he said briefly. It doesn't seem to be working. Okay, let's move on in the interest of time as well. Some have called this politics majoritarian, but that label assumes that over 80% who classify themselves in censuses as Hindu are implicated in the politics of Hindutva. As a matter of fact, not even half of them vote for the BJP. Others speak of ethnic democracy or even ethnocracy that convey the dominance of a particular ethnic group. These terms fail to consider that the nation today is the receptacle of a secular religion. This is what the Italian historian Emilio Gentile has termed a political religion as opposed to a civic one, in which membership in the new religion supersedes all traditional faiths and creeds that came before. Anyone can in principle be a part of this political religion, even Kashmiris, and it cannot be defined by any particular caste or region. But there is in fact an odd ambiguity in how Hindutva in its new democratic incarnation does not disavow any belief or practice that might be described traditionally as Hindu. This greater tolerance for all matters Indic, now termed Hindu, is accompanied, however, by a deep intolerance of anything whose Pitra Bhumi and Punya Bhumi lie outside the subcontinent. Islam in a broad sense, but not Kashmiri and Indian Muslims in general. About Indonesia as the largest Muslim country in the world in population terms, but Ram is venerated and adored there even today. Even more complicated, as we see from Modi's recent efforts. This is Modi with the Archbishop who died very recently from the Marthoma Church. But with Modi, you can also see efforts to play umpire in, for example, disputes between rival fractions of the Malankara Orthodox Church in Kerala. We also see in Arkathong Longkumar's excellent book, the outreach of the BJP and the Sangh Parivar in Christian majority Nagaland. So to sum up, what we have here is a unitary conception of the people in a new political religion headed by Modi, the messianic figure, who's taming the turbulence of democratic politics, rolling back long-standing corruption, nepotism, dynasticism in the political system. It's not surprising then, to get to my last point here about the economy, it's not surprising that policy moves like demonetization and the introduction of the GST, the new indirect tax regime across the country, sought to establish the primacy of politics over economics. When Modi said that hard work matters more than Harvard, he was doing more than taking a snipe at Amartya Sen or any well-known economist. Modi has articulated a new political economy of his sea of political Hindus. Initially, before the last UP election, he justifies demonetization as an anti-corruption move and as a national security policy rolled into one. And then in this particular quote in Hindi, you can see that he urges each individual who's at his political rally. This is a transcript of the speech that he gave in Banaras at the time. And he asks the people there, each of them, to go and explain. Aap swayam kam se kam 10 parivar, 15 parivar, unko sikhaiye. To explain to them why this is necessary and ultimately why this is something in the national interest. Ab Hindustan piche nahi reh sakta. And that is something that he would like each and every of those people assembled there to ultimately put across to their neighbors and friends and family. The people, in other words, are being invited to participate in a new democratic revolution around them. And despite considerable hardship, a majority of voters in UP did vote for the BJP. Modi's other economic policies included the creation of Jan Dhan accounts, Jan Dhan translating as people's wealth, to which direct cash transfers can be made along the lines of Bolsa Familia, for example, in Lula's Brazil. The PM Ujjwala Yojana provides free gas cylinders and subsidized LPG to women below the poverty line. The Jivan Jyoti Bima Yojana and the Jan Arogya Yojana that offers the subsidized life and health insurance plan is also part of the new welfarist mix. Obsession with the GDP matters far less here than conspicuous forms of welfarist redistribution. The central bank and its independent monetary policy too matter less than the sovereignty of the people represented by Modi and his regime. Leftist critics of post-liberalization economic policies in India have tended to rely on the word neoliberalism rather uncritically. The problem, of course, as I've always thought, is with this kind of cut-paste thinking, is that it's never clear to anyone when paleoliberalism in India existed. It is also a problem that the Indian left in all its variety hasn't produced a Lula, yet at least. Atul Kohli has argued that the Indian state lacks a pro-market orientation. It lacks a pro-market orientation, but it has a pro-business tilt. In other words, the post-liberalization state has opened up certain rent-rich sectors of the economy, civil aviation, oil and gas, mining, infrastructure, and telecom, in which James Crabtree tells us a billionaire Raj has flourished. The UPA government tried to tax these and other corporates to finance its workfare and welfare schemes. It's what Manmohan Singh called capitalism with a human face. Partha Chatterjee, in a much-cited EPW article, explained that the state, after liberalization, had stepped up its welfare spending to ensure that the passive revolution of capital didn't run out of steam. Others, however, like Shivaramakrishnan and Gupta, or in the context of counterinsurgency, Lipika Kamra, have shown that the post-liberalization state has actually expanded on its own, as well as via para-state actors in civil society. There is a certain continuity here in Modi's reliance on the billionaire Raj, or a well-known subset thereof, to finance his campaigns and pay for his welfare programs. Yet this regime has no Manmohan or Montek, no Raghuram Rajan or Amit Amartya Sen advising it. No technocratic genius is willing to serve in this regime. But equally, a political religion needs no economists. The Sangh Parivar has its own civil society organizations to expand or extend the reach of the new welfare regime. In the final analysis, the democratic state today remains the primary economic actor in India today as the Vox Populi, with Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat as its main slogans. When farmers in a certain corner of the country protest, however, it may be easy to target Sikh farmers as separatists or Andolanjivi activists, another neologism coined by Modi. Andolanjivi could be characterized as anti-nationals. But what about the rest of the farmers? Sangh-affiliated farmers' outfits protested too. Cracks have thus begun to appear in the facade of the people as they have been presented to us. And of course, this has happened once again now in this wave of the pandemic. In these times, Modi retreats into a meditative state. The shining sun above seems to hide behind dark clouds. And when it resurfaces, it will undoubtedly seek to reinvigorate the people afresh. Crises are neither denied nor wished away. Never waste a good crisis, as they say. A major public health program, for example, in India might be long overdue. But beyond the bells and whistles, or should I say talis and thalis, the people and its leader of many words now face an unprecedented crisis and an uncertain future. An entire political theory is being put through a rather severe test in a way that academic theories are rarely subject to. And thank you. Okay, I am all yours.
Okay. So my microphone's on now. Gosh, Uday, that was absolutely fantastic. And so much to say. I wonder if someone other than me should start. Because, yes,
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you deserve a lot of thalis and thalis for that. It was a great presentation. I mean, I paid attention to words, you paid attention to images, you paid attention to rhetoric. But I just want to think alongside you in this, because I think one of the two things which actually caught my attention, one is the fact that you are arguing that Modi has a political theory to offer, and we must pay attention to this. And I think this is salutary, because very often we dismiss this as mere rhetoric of a crazed mind. So I think that's an important thing. The second thing is that of actually connecting Modi's project to what you call Hindu modernism alongside Gellner and the others. So just keeping those two in mind. Now, what I want to suggest is that what we have here is less political theory and more political bricolage, in the sense that what you find in Modi is the residue, the detritus, the prevalence of a vocabulary that's gone earlier. So, for example, when one talks, I was paying attention to all the clips and so on. One of the clips that you showed where Modi is speaking, and you have this image of the Jawan, the Kisan, and science, central to Nehruvianism. Right? Mm-hmm. So there is a sense in which Modi is hitchhiking on an earlier rhetoric, and this is important because in India, even when you think about the communist movement in Kerala, EMS Namboodiripad presented it as completing the unfinished business of nationalism. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't something that was extremely separate from. So here again, Modi is, in many senses, completing a Nehruvian project, which is why he needs to deny Nehru all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that needs to be thought about, which you didn't speak about. But what role does anti-Nehruvianism play in that rhetoric of Modi and the BJP? Because it's a narcissism, a minor difference, right? That's what I'd like to suggest. So that's one thing. And interestingly enough, if you think about the way he speaks about the temple, if Nehru said dams are the temples of modern India, Modi is saying temples are the temples of modern India. It's the same rhetoric, right? Mm-hmm. And it's deployed. So that's one set of things. The second set of things, if one is thinking with the idea of bricolage, the second idea is that of porosity, because when we move to the realm of identifying a political theory, even though we may resist the idea of texts or of political genealogy, I think there's a certain kind of hermeticism in the way you look at his theory. So, for example, the mode and manner of his rhetoric, as well as the images that he employs. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when he talks about caste, right, and he says there are only two castes, this is the central trope of Hindi film since the 60s. Amir, Garib. These are the only two classes. Nicha Nagar. Right? You think about the multiple motifs that have come up from Chetan Anand onwards to Salim Javed. And his mode of speaking is very much modeled on, I mean, I could have cast Modi in a 70s film, right? And he would have worked. So I think there's that as well. This dualism of Amir and Garib is something that he picks up, which interestingly enough represented the class rhetoric, right? There are only the rich and the poor, or Gandhi's idea of the Daridra Narayan. So I think there again, there is a kind of riding that is happening on an earlier rhetoric. And one of the things about the Ram temple, right? Which brings together the idea of bricolage and porosity, when he says, for example, Ram belongs to all and is in everyone. This echoes so beautifully Purushottam Agarwal's Kan Kan Mein Vyape Hai Ram, which came up. So it was the left rhetoric that, which he's then riding on, but he's appropriated. I mean, I could go on, right? There are various instances that you point out where one can see this kind of oscillation, porosity, and so on. And it's very clear also in the speeches that there is something that is happening that is beyond the articulation of an idea. So that long clip that you played on Bhrashtachar, right? There are 4 elements that he mentions. Only one of them is Kanun, right? The law. The rest is hum thikane laga denge. It's a dog whistle to the constituency that we'll screw these buggers, break their legs.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it's not a political theory. That's not theory. That will break your effing heads, right? Or of our enemies. So I think those kinds of things, I think, are crucial to actually think about Modi as kind of appropriating, right? It's devouring. He is devouring an earlier rhetoric and replaying it, right? So, and which is why I'll end with the last point, which is why when he's that Abhi to Suraj Uga hai, right? Now, Suraj Ugna is the rise, but the word Uga has multiple meanings. The growing of plants, Ugana, to grow, right? So there's a way in which he presents himself as the font and the beginning of, by displacing all that went before. So in that sense, there is nothing original in his rhetoric. And now I'm putting this forward in a very, shall I say, extreme fashion, because you suggest a political theory, and I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that he has an original political theory to offer. He's just somebody who is like a fakir picking up scraps from here and there, putting it together into his joli. And that's what they are. They're scraps of ideas.
Okay, thank you. This is very useful, because I did think a lot about the bricolage idea, and I'm glad you picked it up as well. There are so many things which, of course, I couldn't talk about, like his writing of children's books, and this also goes into this whole anti-Nehruvian kind of. There are so many things, the Bal Narendra kind of imagery and all of. And I do think there's, of course, Indira Gandhi, who was also a looming presence from the 70s, along with the films. And I do, so you can see that pretty much all of, at least post-colonial India, but perhaps even going back to Savarkar and his contemporaries, I think with Gandhi, with Patel, there are these constant conversations and dialogues. There is a sense in which Modi would like to appropriate Ambedkar, every possible icon, every possible, some of these dialogues are more critical than others. Some of these are just kind of appropriations of, like, Patel, for example, in a, but if you see with Ambedkar, you see it with Gandhi, there are somewhat more interesting ways of reclaiming or claiming those legacies. In a somewhat, there are some crooked lines and curves to be drawn. But what I find most interesting is that, is it just a bricolage or an amalgam, or is there something that is more than the sum of its parts that emerges? I suppose that is a question that I want to ask myself, and I mean to all of you, is that, yes, there is this appropriation, there is a kind of mosaic of sorts of bricolage being created. And yet, there is something very striking. Now, it could be possible that what is striking now is simply the audience effect. It is the media, it is a young population where the average age is 26, where all of this, so it is possible that there are media and audience effects which make this look very different in the current setting. But I would suggest that there is something which is more deeply ideological. And I would say it is also, of course, I mean, I think to say that it is ideological is not so, is not exactly novel. But I would say that if we were to join the dots, and if we were to, instead of trying to smooth the curve, so to speak, and I would say that we must pay attention to how Savarkar's thought and links up with what Modi, for example, might be saying, in a way that where we can talk about Hindutva and democracy in some kind of interaction. And for sure, in Modi's words in particular, you will see both Hindutva and democracy theorized. And the relationship between them is often implicitly theorized. And I think ultimately for me, what I'm interested in seeing is how one transforms the other. Of course, there may be many things, including the films, the children's textbooks, and so on, which we can see them as a part of a wider bricolage. But I would say the central relationship for me is him and the people understood in terms of Hindutva and democracy today. Yeah.
Please raise your hands. So, but while I wait for the hands to go up.
I have raised my hand, and I have a question which is actually related to to Dilip's. So can I just come in at this point? Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I find myself agreeing. Yeah, this is SV.
Hi.
Hi. My hairstyle has changed drastically in the recent past. Okay. So I find myself agreeing with both Uday to a certain extent and also Dilip to a certain extent. And I'm glad Indira Gandhi came up in his response. Yeah, she's absolutely a crucial link. If one were to think in terms of Gandhi as in some ways the modern a sadhu figure that is at times being gestured towards, and Indira Gandhi as actually the if you want to call her a populist, yes, but the leader who put together a kind of a package that actually did not ever go out of circulation ever since. I mean, not even the mode of governance. I mean, there's one section of the left which believes that the emergency was not lifted, for example, and that continues to be the case even today. We don't have an emergency, but we do have an emergency. But also that mode of leadership was picked up soon after Indira Gandhi by regional leaders, and I'm using the term advisedly here. And Modi himself this is the very first regional leader we have at the center.
Yes.
Okay, and MGR, you think of MGR in the late 70s, N.T. Ramarao in the early 80s. Exactly the same model. It is my gift, a populist scheme, okay, a benefit or a welfare scheme that the poor receive is my gift to the poor. Okay, MGR said it repeatedly. Indira Gandhi started saying it, but MGR and NTR repeatedly said this. The logic that they adopted, okay, Tamil Telugu nationalism. NTR wasn't even a proper Telugu nationalist. If you want to actually start looking at the substance of his speeches and his work, there's very little substance there. So how was it defined? Exactly in Savarkar's terms. Anybody who lives here, it's fine if you don't speak the language. It's okay. You're living in the geography. So, is he original? Actually, may not be such an interesting question, because I think, as Dilip convincingly said, he's not original. There may be something happening here that may be the transformation of how we understand democracy, and how he's obviously a part of that transformation. But also, just to complete it, now, in terms of nationalism as a model, what are the possibilities? I mean, how much scope is there for originality? If you say that the idea of the nation is non-negotiable, okay, and all the band-aid fixes that were applied, the 370 and so on and so forth, where you try to accommodate various kinds of pressures, or where you granted various kinds of concessions, in order that the idea of the nation doesn't go haywire, right? Or doesn't become exactly like this kind of centrist nightmare that it is today. Now, once you say that, look, actually that I want to take all those bandages off and say that this is the nation and you got to live with it. So does Modi have a choice? I mean, does he have anything else to fall upon? I mean, why not even look at the Hindutva thing? I mean, I'm not questioning his commitment to Hindutva, or rather a rather extreme form of it. But did the Hindutva text have an option if they were committed to nationalism, which they were? I'll stop here.
Thank you. This is very, very, very interesting. And I completely agree with your point about the regional experience that, Modi has been the longest serving chief minister. Yes, we did have people like Narasimha Rao and others who served for a shorter period of time. But I absolutely agree that there is something about state leadership, there's a model which has developed in the post-Indira Gandhi period, which does seem to domesticate within West Bengal or a Tamil Nadu or a Gujarat. It tries to domesticate, and there's obviously much greater control that can be kind of established over the ethnoscape, so to speak, because there is a certain level of control the legislature has. The verdicts are much more decisive. that kind of decisive verdict really wasn't there until 1984 at the national level. And I suppose that is something that to kind of see that as the aim, to bring something which is already there in the federal polity at the state level, and to bring it to Delhi and to try to kind of work on it on the national level. I think there is a kind of scaling up of a kind of politics which has been developing for a very long time. And it is not simply a politics of coalitions, because that is also a politics of scaling up, especially with the parties committed to social justice and caste-based empowerment. But I do think that this kind of scaling up is something that is already visible. It has been visible for a very long time. In fact, in Partha Chatterjee's recent lectures, that he presented, I think it's called "I Am the People." That's what the title of the text is. He goes to Madhava Prasad and talks about MGR, and he talks about this as, in fact, even predating Indira Gandhi. He actually sees this as the origin of populist governance or populist leadership, especially with where the clothes, something where the visual quality of the posters and the leader is very important. It is not just that, hey, I'm a widow. It is something where the glasses you wear, the color of your jacket and your shirt, and these are things which matter. There is a certain kind of style and a swag, and I think this is something which was worked out in the Dravidian movement, at least under MGR. And I do wonder if this is something which perhaps has a different vernacular resonance in different other parts. So, and certainly in Gujarat, when it became a question of Gujarati Asmita when he was chief minister about 15 years ago, I do think that there is something that we need to delve into, because perhaps there is a deeper history of the vernacularization of democracy that we've missed, because we often focus on one region, UP or Tamil Nadu, but I do think that there is this kind of creative borrowing, and there is a vernacularization where the Gujarati version of it is not just a replica. It is something which has certain very unique qualities, even though it is perfectly recognizable from the Bihari or the Tamil contexts. And this is something that I have been thinking about for a while, but it is really I have to think about how to bring this in, especially Modi himself moving from Gandhinagar to Delhi, and what this would mean, especially because of what some of the things you said about, in particular about politics after Indira, which never really, we've never really stopped being in Indira Gandhi's regime at some level. And so I completely take both what you and Dilip are saying about not just continuities, but what seems to be a kind of lack of originality. I think that is a very important, because that for me, is this just about, even Modi actually. Modi thinks that there is a certain cyclical quality to the history that he's living out. Yes, we are making history, but we are making it again. So Modi also has the same theory of history in that sense. But sorry, go ahead.
So I have a brief comment, and then it will be Uday and then Michael Collins following. Now, I think, Dilip, all theory is bricolage. If theory is a way of seeing the world in some sense, it's got to be composed of familiar enough parts to be visible. So I think in that sense, there's, theory does not need to be original. In fact, it mustn't be original substantially. What's really distinctive about what you said, Uday, is the messianic bit. I mean, that is interesting, and it very much rings true to what I've thought about Modi. And now I wonder if we're talking about the lexicon on which Uday, are you there? Have we lost Uday? Uday, come back.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Now, what I wonder is, where is the messianic? I mean, you're translating an idiom into a sort of Judeo-Christian lexicon, right? By talking about this is messianism. What is it about, I suppose, the Vaishnava devotion, this bhaktiism that I suppose you're translating as messianism, makes you want to translate it as that?
I mean, there are two different things, and I have to think much more carefully about how I'm going to connect. One is the question of Saguna Bhakti, which is, say, focused on Ram or Krishna, and whether that kind of bhakti, when people say Modi Bhakt, we need to kind of say something a little more than just saying these are bhakts and we are arguing with them or they're trolls or whatever. That's one aspect of it. And the second has to do with the question of the Kalki avatar, this idea of the Kali Yuga has its own kind of decisionism, so to speak. But it is not quite decisionism because, the Kalki avatar, there's a very interesting kind of debate in a religious studies circle about when actually people started referring to it. But the Kalki Purana, at least in Bengal, is very much an 18th century text. It is perhaps, it might have, versions of it might have been, for example, might have been dated back to the century before, or maybe even 2 centuries before, if you're very generous, but in the kind of oral tradition. But it does seem that there is, it really, whether it is coming from the Abrahamic religions or whether it is really a homegrown thing like the Maitreya Buddha, it is very hard for me to adjudicate some of, because there are obviously different scholarly voices. But one thing I will say, whether you regard it as truly Indic or not, but it is of relatively recent provenance. It is not something which you can go back to the Vedas or something for. And it is certainly not something that featured in the leading nationalist thought a century or so ago. However, as we see from Sumit Sarkar's work on the Kalki avatar of Bikrampur and so on, that you see that there are local kind of or relatively localized kind of messianic figures, so to speak, who seem to arrive. I mean, I don't want to use the word prophetic because that, I think, takes us much more into a different kind of theological idiom. But the idea that there is some kind of millenarian, perhaps millenarian ideas, and that there are individuals who attract following, they're kind of short-lived. They're kind of, in many cases, flash in the pans. But there is this constant promise of new heaven, new earth. And there are a number of people, and back in the day, I used to work on Birsa Munda as one such figure in a very different context, and who literally, of course, there's the influence of Christian missionaries and so on, but I would say beyond those influences, I would say that there is something rather creative about the bricolage that these people are able to come up with. And it's always a bricolage because these are people who are between worlds. Some of them are literary flaneurs.
Uday, please.
Can you see me?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one is really about the status that we give to the idea of theory here, because you were trying to develop this argument quite convincingly that there is a political theory here. Now, usually when we talk about theory, we have in mind a certain body of propositions, principles, arguments, etc., which would explain the coherence of a certain set of positions, behavior. And I think that you try to show that that is indeed the case in Modi's speeches and what he says. But I wondered if this is complicated by the fact that these speeches and these statements are also actions in the political domain, because these utterances really are not merely explanatory statements, but they are actually ways of doing things. Like each of these statements is actually a way of exhibiting oneself, a way of mobilizing a certain population, a certain section of the population, creating a particular effect or change in the relationship between forces in the political domain. So now if we take that dimension of these statements seriously, then probably the level of theory recedes one step further. That is, we have to think of a political theory which actually instrumentally puts these statements into play, deploys these statements in order to create effects. Yeah. So then the question of silence, for example, that becomes very interesting, because silence at the moment in your presentation, it looks like silence is outside this theory. Whereas if we see this action, the political action that he performs, as what we need to understand in terms of theory, then the silence is very much part of that. That's a particular kind of action. And in the political domain, definitely Modi's silences are really of that kind. Yes. So I just wondered how do we take into account this, the political utterance as a form of action, and bring that to bear upon the analysis of these statements, texts, etc., etc. So that's the first question. And the second question has some relationship to all the points which have been made about whether there is something singular or unique about Modi, if he's merely a continuation of what happened before. I tend to think that there is something different happening, and which is also why it has been very difficult to formulate a kind of political strategy which succeeds against him. There is something which is different operating there. And when I was listening to you, I also felt that maybe we need to also look at the kind of political subjectivity which is being made or which is sought to be created among the people through these kinds of utterance, actions, etc., etc. And one thing about the Modi, there was some discussion about the idea of bhakti. That's very interesting, because unlike the earlier populist leaders, the idiom of love is not really very dominant in the Modi cult. That is why bhakti is really, Modi bhakt is the dominant word. It's not really like there is this attachment in terms of love. In fact, there is a kind of deliberate underplaying of any kind of tender emotion on the part of the leader, even when the leader is actually accosting the people and addressing the people. It is not in terms of love, but in terms of leading a fight against some common enemy. So these emotions of something which is somewhat harsh, something which is stern, etc., etc., are frequently mobilized. Like, think about the post-demonetization speeches. There is the demand that, there is the statement that I'm putting you to trouble. And, I am sorry that I'm putting you to trouble, but I have to put you to trouble. And you have to bear with me, And similarly, during the initial state of the pandemic. So there is this idea that the leader is somebody who takes tough decisions all the time and is demanding of the people that they bear with him, because these are tough decisions which need to be taken. And the language of love and the language of a connect which is emotionally tender is not adequate for this connection. You need a kind of more masculine, aggressive, and somewhat, what would be the opposite of tender, somewhat harsh kind of tonality in that. And I think that kind of populism probably is not so common in the Indian political tradition. So I just wondered what you wanted to.
Absolutely. This is very, very useful. And, I have to say that the last part of what you said about the kind of harsh, it is an ascetic masculinity, but it is not, it doesn't kind of come across as kind or tender or generous. And it is much more, Anastasia, I think, you could come in here, because the kind of masculinity that you see and the authority as it is performed in much more micro levels of sovereignty, that is actually visible for the first time at the national level. Because, in our fieldwork, we encounter such figures all the time. But none of them goes on to become the prime minister. Right? And but there is a certain familiarity with such figures, especially the way they speak, the way they conduct themselves. People hold back. They might have an intimate life, but we don't know and we don't see it, right? There is a certain way in which weakness is not shown, mistakes are not admitted. There are a number of things of this nature. The other thing which I wanted to talk about, but in the interest of time I couldn't, is humor. Modi's humor, which is a category of his speech acts, is very peculiar. First of all, many of the things that he says are not funny to any of us. They are not funny for many reasons. Partly because of the way, but I would like to say that his jokes, or what he finds funny, or what many people would say is funny, is a kind of jibe which is directed at a certain person or category of persons. And what he wants you to do is essentially have it's a kind of inside joke with his audience. So for example, when he's talking about Shashi Tharoor's deceased wife, to say, as he did before he was elected, to say 50 lakh ki girlfriend and then have a laugh with some other men who's there. This is a particular kind of humor. Likewise, if you say something about Kabristan, and there is a word play on it, or there is a certain way in which you are referring to a category of persons without naming them, there is a certain kind of implied humor and a connect that the populist leader has. So I would say that there is it is very hard for me to come up with an adjective for what kind of humor it is. It is cruel humor, but there is a certain targeted nature of it. And what is happening is that we are being asked to become insiders on this joke, which many of us might find tasteless and not funny at all.
It's an Oxbridge seminar style humor.
Yes. I completely agree that, and sorry, I am looking at what is happening in the chat also, so I do want to say that is something about his speech acts in general. I think I really like the fact, what you were saying, that his speech as well as his silences, they ought to be seen as actions, not just so there is a way in which political words and political actions come together. And I think when we are talking about the question of masculinity, including the elisions and the silences, the evasions, the kind of deep reluctance to admit that one is wrong in public. This is something that I do think is very important. There is a kind of elocutionary effect of the speech acts, including of the silences. And I think the question that you raised at the end of that first point about what it means for crafting subjectivities in the public sphere. What happens to the people when they are spoken to and acted upon by such a person? What kind of public arises from this? And I think here, I completely agree with the conversation in the chat about bhakti having a long kind of, it goes back, right? Ambedkar's point about bhakti was about Gandhi after all. And certainly Nehru knew a few things about bhakti too, but I do think that the kind of political personality that we forge is quite distinct. Asceticism, I don't think it is a new point at all, whether it's Indira Gandhi or, but these are points that have been made. You see it even with people like Mamata Banerjee and other people with the populism and the asceticism and the Hawaii chappals. But I think that there is something about the nature of his speech, whether it is humorous or whether it is not, in which, there is, it is a kind of demotic speech. And one of the things which I'm trying to figure out is how do we understand this? Because, it is not the kind of thing that most of his political rivals engage in. But at the same time, when we do our field work as ethnographers, we see such people and such speech all the time. There is a ubiquity about this. And so there is a kind of way in which I want to suggest that, yes, at the national level, you don't see it, but it is not something that we have never seen. It is not so unfamiliar that we cannot recognize.
Michael Collins, please.
I really, really enjoyed your talk today. This is fantastic. I think I have two just kind of probably bland questions, fairly general questions for you. And the first one is about the distinction between a political theory of Narendra Modi and brand Modi. And kind of the emergence of, because we're looking at speech acts, we're looking at a performance, as you've noted, but with the growth of political consultancy firms, PR firms, public surveys, trying to kind of shape this brand. Because on the one hand, this political speech act is producing something, but it's also at the same time responding to something. So I'm wondering if we were to look at Modi's development of a political theory, if we use that phrase, from before 2014 and today, what types of changes might we see, not just in the performance aspect, but in the production aspect, if I can use that word. And then the other question kind of goes back to what you were just saying about humor, is at CMIS, we were tracking BJP political rhetoric in different South Indian states. And the idea was to look at the types of language, the vernacular idioms that the BJP uses in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And the BJP completely just failed in Tamil Nadu. They had to actually explain their memes. Their memes in Tamil just did not make sense. And then they had to send out these disclaimers of, oh, well, this meme actually means this. And so I'm wondering about the stability and transferability of this theory as the BJP tries to move into different linguistic states. And I guess the limits of translation, the limits of idioms, and what we might see there. And I know this is probably stretching you beyond what you're looking at, but maybe connecting with some of your friends at CMIS and gathering some of these vernacular materials might be interesting to consider. Thank you so much for this talk. Very interesting.
Thank you. This is great. And in fact, in the chat, Dilip and I were once I think last week we were talking about. I mean, he sent his draft. I don't know if it's been published yet, Dilip, the piece on Scroll. And I do think that even though the BJP seems to, in the media rhetoric in the pandemic wave now seems to be that, oh, well, the BJP has really not been able to win, whatever that means. But I do think that the Tamil public sphere is the hardest for the BJP to get into for various reasons. And it is not only to do with Dravidianism. I do think that Kerala and West Bengal more so, they are just a few steps away from a BJP government. I mean, the BJP, winning 40% of the votes in West Bengal. How many people 5 years ago would have been able to predict this? If you notice the media coverage, they had to compare the seats and everything with 2019, with the national election. They refused to go back to 2016 because that would have really complicated what the simplistic narrative that they were presenting was trying to tell us. And so I do feel that there is some kind of sense in which translatability is possible when people from within the state, for varying reasons, take up the cause and come up with the memes and slogans themselves. And I think that is much easier to achieve in West Bengal than it is to achieve in Kerala, and it is definitely easier to achieve in Kerala than it is in Tamil Nadu today. But if you look at what has happened in the Kannada language media, if you look at what has happened in Nagaland or Arunachal, you will. I think one of the most striking things is the ability of this ideology to be malleable. And I do think that it involves moving from the realm of ideology to something which is much more supple. It is not simply ideology on the one hand and strategizing, branding, PR on the other hand, right, with the likes of Prashant Kishore and others. There is something in between, and that is where I think there is a political theory. In the same way that I would say, if you would look at Gandhi's political thought, you might also say that there is a bricolage. And you might say that some of Gandhi's critics, certainly in his own time, thought of him as merely a kind of cloak for certain interests. Or you could say, and they were also, just like there is Ambani and Adani, they were the relevant people in Gandhi's lives. In Gandhi's life, but I wonder if there is a kind of a way in which you can use Gandhi to make all kinds of arguments. including, for example, the recent argument about his fascination with violence, which is not one that is traditionally made by Gandhians himself, right? And I wonder if, and like Modi, I would suggest, I mean, this is kind of odd comparison, but I would say that like Modi, Gandhi seems to have been a man on the move, a man who picked up various ideas when he went. Even on caste, if you look at the way his thinking changed, on just one issue of caste, I think you will find that, yes, it is possible to pick up a sentence and put him in one corner, but it is always more complicated than that. Likewise with Modi, it is actually quite difficult. And if you think you know what his views on caste are or what his views on a particular issue is, you might be surprised at times if you actually look more exhaustively at what he's saying about the issue at different times. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
That's very good. Melinda, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, but we can't see you.
I just turned on my
Settings and refresh it. There you go.
Okay, now we
can. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Uday. I mean, I obviously enjoyed very much your work on Birsa Munda, and it's amazing to hear your talk today. I just want to pick up on something that you said about why West Bengal is more attuned to Hindu nationalism than perhaps Kerala or Tamil Nadu, and combine that with Anastasia's very interesting point about all messiahs being bricollages. And I think my gut feeling, and maybe I would urge Anastasia, like having a panel discussion on Prabhutavad, to actually have a panel discussion on messianic sovereignty, because of my own interest in it, is it goes back really, I mean, my suggestion would be it goes back to the late 19th century. Particularly, I mean, and Bengali Hindu nationalist discourses like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Anandamad, Devi Chaudhurani, these are absolutely crucial in thinking about the avatar. And the avatar is understood in a very bricolage manner. So Bankim Chandra deliberately compares Jesus as a messiah and how he is inferior to to Krishna, and also he compares, for example, Krishna to Bismarck and Cavour and Mazzini and Garibaldi, because the unification of India, it supposedly in ancient times is compared to the unification of Italy and Germany in the 1860s, 70s. In Krishna Charitra, Bankim Chandra had this amazing sentence where he says, Krishna is an avatar because he unifies India. So there is this kind of strong notion of the political avatar, and of course that's picked on very much in extremist nationalist discourse. In the 1900s, for example, you have Bipin Chandra Pal translating Hegel's conception of the Volksgeist, the spirit of the people, into the idea of Jatiyo Shakti, and then identifying that in Krishna, in the Japanese emperor, in a whole lot of figures. And I have talked about this in my book, and I have a forthcoming article on this as well, how kind of German monarchic and this kind of Hegelian discourses are vernacularized into a very strong incarnational idea of sovereignty. And of course, this ties into what Andrew Sartori also calls immanentist monism, the idea that the transcendental God is made immanent in the nation, and within the nation in this kind of avatar, prince, ruler-like figure. So my sense is, I mean, I do think, Uday, I do agree with you that Modi is emphasizing a political theory. I think, however, it's coming within a longer trajectory and democratizing things which are very fundamental and central to Hindu nationalism, but which has never really been picked up in studies of Indian political thought, because people have tended to focus on secularist figures like Nehru and Ambedkar, and not on figures like, you know, Bankim Chandra or Modi, which would reveal a very different dimension, a political theology of Hindu nationalism, which is something which needs far more work on. So I really enjoyed, and I'm looking forward so much to reading your work very soon.
Thank you so much, Melinda. And I actually read, when I was writing this, I was reading chapters 4 and 5 of your wonderful book, which dealt with the late colonial context. And I really like and one of the things which people have written in the, say, the Russian context, I don't know if people have looked at Fields in the Name of the Tsar, the idea of naive monarchism. And naive monarchism, there are people who've made very interesting use of it in terms of Putin's Russia, and how there is a return in the countryside to certain ideas of this nature. The idea of the Tsar as the deliverer. These ideas are very much, and also you see there is now a very interesting body of cultural history emerging out of China, which rethinks the Cultural Revolution and how it was perceived by fairly young people as a youthful kind of, well, the aging Mao, but a youthful following. And I do think that Maoism, which is something that I used to work on a little bit earlier, I do think that the cult of Mao, or the cult of the idea of the Tsar as the deliverer, we in India have not had something quite as comparable. Usually, the examples that we've all worked on, Birsa Munda or any particular figure that you've looked at, or Sartori, they tend to be, the avatar tends to be relatively localized figures. But to have someone in a kind of all India context, right? I mean, this is, I think, where the question of newness for me comes in. Even if I absolutely agree that there is this long genealogy that goes back to the mid to late 19th century, where I would say this way of this particular kind of bricolage kind of gathers steam. And I do think that that is actually where the origin lies.
And just to quickly add to your point, I completely agree that Modi is instantiating as a person, as a pan-national leader, something which the late 19th century could only have thought of as a fantasy, simply because they did not have the political, bureaucratic, governmental machinery to instantiate that. And picking on your wonderful point about the Ram Mandir, I was watching the rituals, and it's so fascinating that this idea of incarnating the nation in the temple, this is such a late 19th century discourse. And it's used to legitimate, you know, the Durga Puja, the Shivaji Utsav, all of that in the 1900s. It's just nobody had that kind of leviathanic machinery to actually implement that in practice. And I think I completely agree with you that what's distinctive about Modi is the ability to practicalize these kind of older visions and fantasies. So really, I'm so looking forward to talking more and reading your work.
We should do a panel on all of this, but I completely agree with people in the chat about the sexualized or desexualized nature of the messianic figure.
Yes, also Lipika drew our attention to something in the chat that I think is very important, because in our conversation, we have sort of started to collapse Modi the theoretician and Modi the image, and you know, whether it's bricolage or coherent, you know, or is it at least intended to have a coherent logic of its own. And Lipika is pointing out in the chat, and Lipika, could you say a few words about that? Lipika is pointing out that the image of Modi that's projected by his devotees, his the IT crowd that swarms around and so on, is quite different from what Modi himself is saying. So, could you?
I mean, there might be parallels at times, but I mean, it's sort of like, as Anastasia was also saying, like all messiahs, there is the kind of persona beyond just what they themselves project, right? So even in this case, with the expansion of digital media in particularly, Bhakts and, you know, other IT cell people just have a field day in projecting Modi in different ways. And, you know, after Pulwama, there was this constant stream of messages which all ended with, say, something like Modi hai to mumkin hai. And the idea was that Modi is, you know, he can do anything, and with him everything's possible. So I think in that larger bricolage, if you're calling it that, you know, what people beyond Modi do to his persona, I think also might be important to do that.
Yes. Yes, I mean, completely. And this is also something that ties back to what Michael was saying about branding and PR. And there's a whole infrastructure, right, that now exists with people kind of, you know, kind of amplifying certain ideas, connecting with others, the hashtags and all of this stuff, the WhatsApp groups. And I am mindful that there is, and what I've tried to do is to really try to get what this guy is saying. Of course, he's been working with his speech coach and everything else. But what I'm trying to get at is something that Modi, in his own words, articulates. Because I do understand that once it gets into this echo chamber, especially online, there are all kinds of things which are said which Modi himself would not say. And so we must be very clear, because Modi is silent on many things which his followers are not silent on. And we really need to be able to identify the silences, because they are very meaningful, as Uday was saying.
Yeah.
And on that loud note, we've come to the end of our conversation. Thank you, Uday, so much for an absolutely wonderful, thought-provoking session. And thank you, everyone, for coming and for piping up. And I hope more of you do as the conversations go on. And now the next thing to look forward to is in a fortnight, and that will be Piers Vitebsky speaking about the movement from parasitic feudalism to responsible hierarchy in northeastern India. So stay tuned and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.